Hello Year 10 and welcome to this lesson on B13.3, which is entitled The Best of Both Worlds, and it concerns organisms which are able to reproduce both sexually and asexually. So initially, just to get you started and remind yourself as to what we've learned so far on this topic, just jot down what you can remember so far about reproduction. You can pause the video here to give yourself a moment to do that. So here you can see where this lesson fits in the scheme of learning. We have already learned about sexual and asexual reproduction, and we have had a lesson on meiosis. You have a second lesson this week on DNA, because that is the same topic that the rest of Year 10 are currently learning. This DNA in the genome lesson is a lesson specifically for the biology scheme of learning, so it's a little extra that you need to do. So our objectives for this lesson require us to be able to identify the advantages of asexual and sexual reproduction. That should be already familiar to you. It's to explain how plants, fungi and parasites reproduce, and to justify the need for two systems of reproduction within the same organism. So earlier in the topic, we spent some time learning about the differences between sexual and asexual reproduction, reminding yourself that sexual reproduction involves different genetic material from each of the two parents to be passed on to the offspring, whereas asexual reproduction is where a single parent passes their entire genome onto the offspring. We also learned last lesson about meiosis, which is the form of cell division where gametes are formed. And remember that in formation of gametes, the number of chromosomes or the amount of genetic material is halved. So in this case, or in the case of animals, we would make eggs and sperm, each of which with half the normal number of chromosomes. In plants, we would make pollen and ovules, each again with half the number of chromosomes of a full cell. So a little bit of a reminder, but it might be one or two new ideas in here as well. So just divide up these ideas into whether they are an advantage for sexual or asexual reproduction. And again, you can pause here to give yourself a little bit of time to complete that activity. So our answers are as follows. First one, produces variation in offspring, is going to be from sexual reproduction. However, only one parent is needed is in asexual, and asexual reproduction is also faster than sexual reproduction. It's also more time and energy efficient, as the parent doesn't need to find a mate. However, if the environment changes, variation will give a survival advantage by natural selection. Goes with sexual reproduction because variation can only be gained where there's more than one parent and genetic material is being shared between the two. Natural selection can be speeded up by humans in selective breeding to increase food production. So if in the case of plants, humans want a particular pair of plants to produce seeds together, they would take the pollen from one individual and they would brush it onto the stigma, the female part of another flower, and that would speed up the process of breeding, and it would ensure that the pollen of the chosen flower pollinates the female chosen flower. In animals, this can be done by taking sperm from the male organism and deliberately inserting it into the female organism, thus producing a pregnancy much more quickly and with the desired parents. And finally, many identical offspring can be produced when the conditions are favourable. So, for example, in plants, and particularly if we're trying to make a crop very quickly, we may well have used natural selection to produce the ideal plant, perhaps a strawberry with beautiful, sweet, juicy berries. And then once we've got that organism with those genes, we can then use asexual reproduction to produce many of those plants which all have the same genes, and therefore all of the strawberries will have the same taste and juicy nature. So now we're going to have a look at fungi, plants and parasites, and we are going to see how each of them use both sexual and asexual reproduction in their life cycles. Malarial parasites can reproduce asexually in a human and sexually in the mosquito. We'll have a look at that in more detail in a moment. We'll also have a look at how fungi can reproduce asexually by spores, but can also reproduce sexually, so that there's some variation in the next generation. And as we've already seen, plants can produce seeds sexually, but they can also use runners or bulb division in order to produce new plants asexually. So this is the life cycle of Plasmodium, which is the protist, which is a parasite which causes malaria. And it spends part of its life cycle in the mosquito and part of its life cycle in the human. You don't need to remember all of these complicated words. I'm just going to talk you briefly through the life cycle, and it is enough for you to know that it uses both asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction in its life cycle. So initially, let's start with the parasite being injected into a human by a mosquito when the mosquito bites the human. There are cells in the Plasmodium which produce specific cells called merozoites, and these can infect red blood cells, and this is what makes us ill. The merozoites reproduce asexually inside the red blood cells. They cause the infected red blood cell to burst, and some of the cells that are released from that red blood cell are gametes. So when a new mosquito then bites an infected person, they will pick up some of those gamete cells, and then the gamete cells are going to fuse together to form a zygote, and then meiosis takes place, bringing the number of chromosomes back down to the single value that it was at the start. And then these sporozytes, as they are now called, can then be injected into a new human. So the asexual reproduction occurs in the red blood cells of a human, and the sexual reproduction occurs in the mosquito. In fungi, we've also got both processes taking place. The mycelium is the mesh of cells which makes up a fungus. Fungi also sometimes have a fruiting body, which is the section you see coming up above the ground, but the majority of a fungus is actually in the ground, unseen. And this is a haploid set of cells, so it's got one N in terms of its number of chromosomes. This mycelium can make its own spores, which will also be 1N. They will be identical to the mycelium. Those spores can then grow separately, they move away from the original body, and they can grow into a new mycelium. However, in order to introduce variation, it's also an advantage for the fungus to reproduce sexually. So the way that it does this is that more than one haploid cell from the body of different fungi can fuse together. And when that happens, they make a zygote because it contains two sets of DNA. And then that zygote undergoes meiosis in the same way as we just saw in the Plasmodium. And we go back down to having the haploid number of chromosomes in the spores, but that there has been some mixing up, some swapping over of DNA, because the particular set of chromosomes that ends up in each spore is random due to meiosis. That means that when these spores grow into a new mycelial mesh, they will be genetically different to their parent. So here we have plant reproduction. Just a reminder, if we start with the flower, which in this diagram is being shown as having a stamen in yellow with a sort of bobble on top, which is the anther, which contains the pollen. The green circle in the middle is the ovary. Inside that we have an egg, or its proper name in a plant is an ovule. And above it you have the style and the stigma. So a pollen grain arrives on the stigma, helped there by the wind or by animals or even by a human. And the pollen grain grows a tube down through the style into the ovary and fertilizes the egg. So the fertilized egg is now ready to become the embryo, and this is diploid. The seed can then be planted or find its way into some soil, get some water and some oxygen, and begin to germinate and produce a new plant, which produces seeds, which makes flowers, which undergoes meiosis, which produces the eggs and the pollen, and these are both diploid. Alternatively, plants can use several different methods to reproduce asexually. In the top picture here we have got daffodil bulbs, and you can see that the bulbs are splitting, and each of those bulbs would grow into a new daffodil plant which is genetically identical to the original. And then we've got the runners coming from the strawberry plants here in order to grow more new strawberry plants, which would be genetically identical to their parent. And remember that there is also a link here to producing lots of food for the human population. So the questions on the next two slides are going to form part of your submitted work to me, please. The first one says, a woman planted seeds that she got from strawberries in her garden, and in time these produced strawberries too. Explain why the strawberries did not taste the same. Pause the video here for you to answer that part. And the second part of this question is, identify how the woman could make more strawberry plants that produced strawberries that did taste the same, and explain why this method would work. And the next question is, explain why an organism of your choice would have evolved to be able to reproduce both sexually and asexually. That's worth 4 marks. And finally, what do we mean by N and 2N in genetics? And that's just 1 mark. Remember, there is additional support for you on pages 200 and 201 in your textbook. And for those of you who like a challenge, there's also stretch and challenge questions on these slides. And one was to imagine a world without reproduction. You could have a go at that if you wanted to. Or describe the life cycle of Plasmodium or a fungus. So all you need to submit are the answers to the questions on the previous 3 slides. That's the standard questions, which were out of 10 marks altogether. But you're very welcome to submit anything else that you have worked on through the lesson or that you have chosen to do in addition. And please also remember that you have the general biology lesson to complete as well this week, which is B13.4 DNA and the genome. So you could go back to your little starter activity and see what else you could add to your notes on what you know of reproduction already. And you could always choose to begin making revision cards for this topic as you go along, or anything else that's going to support your learning. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch, and I will see some of you, no doubt, in school. Take care. Bye for now.